Well, it is day 2 of 4 of the ANC's 5th NGC taking place here in Ekurhuleni and Gauteng. And as we did yesterday, we are here to make sure that you are taken along, because that's one of the issues that the ANC is, of course, deliberating on, how society should not be left behind as the organization moves ahead with its proposed policies. Now, I'm joined, as I was yesterday, by SABC News politics editor Mzwandile Mbeje, as well as SABC specialist correspondent Sophie Mokoena. Thanks so much for coming through once more. But I want us to delve right in. Let's jump in there, because I want to talk about the balance of forces, because when you read the documents and you look at the current state of play in South Africa, it speaks to directly these issues. But the question, of course, is, so what? What has been done about it? And how do these policy proposals actually fit into what is being addressed? And then, of course, not forgetting, this is, of course, a midterm review of policies that were adopted in the last conference. Now, the balance of forces. And I just quickly want to jump in here regarding what exactly it is that the ANC envisages here. And there are, of course, 5 key pillars that were identified. And speaking to those regarding the balance of forces, it is, of course, the state, the economy, ideological struggles and the battle of ideas, motive forces and organizational work, and of course international work. So those are some of the issues, the pillars that they delve into. And I must say, it made for quite interesting reading, Sophie and Mzwai, with regard to where we find ourselves, the regression due to state capture and corruption, which is something that continues to be pivotal, and which, of course, some would say has contributed in broad strokes to the decline that the ANC has suffered. Mzwai?
Yes, a very good morning to you, Sakina, and the viewers. It is actually very interesting when you go through that document and look at what is being proposed there versus the current state of what is currently happening, particularly within the ANC. You would know, having covered these conferences, that has always been the issue, the balance of forces. How do you become hegemonic in terms of society and the ideas? So right now, these delegates would have their work cut out for them. I'll tell you why. Because they are, inverted commas, on the back foot. You even look at the program of government, of the government of the GNU, how much the ANC had to perhaps take a bit of a back step, because they couldn't push everything that they wanted, because they had to do the compromise. So you are then meeting in the conference of this nature, being on, in inverted commas, on the back foot. So how much are you going to be able to influence exactly that which you are speaking about, because you have lost some power? So the responsibility for these delegates who are here is to be able to reclaim the ANC the way they want it, because you will not be able to influence anything significantly if your influence is reduced anyway. So that's why I'm making a practical example of the GNU, where you had to have common priorities with all other parties. Just think about how the ANC would have fashioned itself going forward without any influence of other parties. So those are some of the key areas. So for me, it will really be interesting to see today, particularly, because today is the day of the commissions, where the delegates will go in, discuss exactly those issues. So how do they wiggle themselves out of the situation?
And Sophie, for your part, because among other things, they go into the unrest, the July unrest that we had gone through. They identify issues such as what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, the PPE corruption, but also the mafia that are operating in the construction sector, among others. And remembering that this was identified before last year's electoral decline and before the formation of the GNU.
I think they are correct to admit that things didn't go well in those areas. For example, the issue of the July unrest bordered on the security of the country, but also the role of the intelligence and the cohesion within the Security Council that is being chaired by the president. Whether did they have proper intelligence information, and when that intelligence information was presented, what did they do about it? And then the other issue, you speak about the issue of the PPE. It is true that that led to many people saying that some ANC leaders don't learn. They are continuing with corruption. Post the State Capture Commission report and recommendations, which were still being discussed and finding a way to implement the recommendation, then you have the PPE. It looks like you are not willing to learn. And therefore, last year when they went to elections, the nation in general had all these things in mind, including poor service delivery. And therefore, South Africans were saying, it can't be business as usual. But I want to emphasize again, the story for last year's election, we seem to be missing a real story. It's those millions who didn't go to the polls. Why? Because they felt there's no alternative. And therefore, this NGC must look at that. How do you go back to ensure that you instill that trust to those millions who didn't go to the polls, who are saying, we don't see any alternative? You can only go back to them if you really mend your ways. You show remorse, you show a change of heart, and not only in terms of words, but also in deeds. But if you still see some senior ANC leaders before the commissions being fingered, and there are allegations, because perceptions can be very, very dangerous ahead of local government election. That might have an influence. And therefore, the delegates who are here at the NGC representing the ANC members who are not here, they must do the work. They must sit in that hall, not move around, to discuss. When they get out of here, they go back to the structures. They communicate a way forward in terms of demonstrating practically that they did listen to the South Africans, to the Africans, and to the world, because the balance of forces doesn't only mean you talking inward. You also have to look what's happening on the continent, but also around the world. When you look at the foreign policy, how it's under siege, and how the president had to push back many times in terms of some of the foreign policy position of the country. And therefore, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It has to be about real discussions. And yesterday, when the mood was subdued, I think that was a right tone to show that you are really worried about the situation, but behind the scenes or behind closed doors, you will be able to really be robust and engage on these issues. But when you walk out of that, the doors on Thursday, when you leave, you have to leave as a united force with one command in terms of way forward.
You know, I'm reminded of the NGC of 2000 in PE, now Gqeberha, where the president then of the ANC, President Mbeki, who was sitting there, spoke of a new cadre. If ever the ANC needed a new cadre, right, it is now. Because the performance of the ANC, the perception of the ANC is also linked to the behavior of those who are entrusted with responsibility. Yes, you can say all the right things. You can speak about all the good things. How people will judge you is the conduct. Sometimes it's not what you say, but it's what you do that will actually make people believe. So that new cadre that the former president spoke about back then is what the ANC needs right now. because they are at their weakest since the 30 years of democracy. So at your weakest, you have to re-emerge. And how do you re-emerge? By the new cadre, we don't just talk about someone brandishing themselves as new cadres, but we're talking about someone who is deployed to a municipality somewhere in Northwest or KZN, who is able to make a difference in his or her community. That is a new cadre. So this NGC, for me, should be able to deal with those. Yes, you can be boisterous, you can be happy, but when you walk out of here, so you need to demonstrate that you were at the NGC at Birchwood in 2025 by these deeds. As Sophie had said, that sometimes actions won't say much. It's the deeds that will tell the story.
Indeed. And as the two of you are speaking, you know, I'm flashing through this document to look at, you know, some of the issues. Because, again, we always say it, and it is true, that the ANC is probably better than anyone at diagnosing their own problems. But what do they do about the diagnosis? Now, also, it goes on to speak about if basic services crumble, the entire NDR project suffers because the state loses credibility among the people.
And that's what happened last year.
Exactly.
That's what happened last year with elections. Failure to deliver services led to a situation where people lost trust in the political system, not only in government, but also in the political system. That is why you saw those large numbers of people who didn't go to the polls.
And then I want to move on to the economy, because this is also a critical issue, especially on the back of the G20 and what was discussed there in terms of how South Africa and the global South in particular are to move forward and the posture that we are likely to assume.
In fact, as I was also paging through some of the documents, I remember there was a time where South Africa was being compared to Brazil. And I think the document does acknowledge that as the most unequal societies, I think these two countries. But look at what Brazil has done in terms of trying to close that gap. And the question is, why are we not being able to do exactly that? Because at some point, in fact, very interestingly, they hosted the G20 last year, and then we are hosting this year. So what is it that is stopping us from being able to narrow that gap? So what are the fundamental issues economically that we need to look at as a country? Well, in this instance, as the ANC. So that for me is how are they going to, when they look at the balance of forces, motive forces, how are they going to diagnose the difficulty that we have seen long time ago, and those friends who we were in the same pool with somehow are getting out? We still remain there. What is it? Even our neighbors, countries which are much lower than us, like Zambia, are doing much better than us in terms of lifting people out of poverty.
Well,
and South Africa has even better resources.
We're running out of time, but there is an acknowledgement in the policy document that the macroeconomic policy has not delivered the required growth for South Africa, Sophie.
Well, I think there are factors that led to sluggish growth. But I think what needs to be done is to ensure that now that there's a new approach in terms of reviving the economy, you have to push the infrastructure. You have to ensure that the South African infrastructure is up to, the levels that it's supposed to be. Without a proper infrastructure, you are not going to grow the economy. What is your infrastructure? Is your ports, your roads, but also including power. Now that we have been able to address the issue of electricity, go back to the production, because only manufacturing can take you out of this trouble. We know that manufacturing suffered a lot because companies had to reduce their output in terms of manufacturing when there was no power, particularly sectors such as mining. We know we may not have touched on it very well in terms of making the South Africans aware that the production in mining you have to reduce because you don't have enough power. But the issue of transport, lifeblood of commerce, transport is the lifeblood of commerce. You have to ensure that your infrastructure you are pushing. And I guess the president's report indicated that there's progress in those areas. And I think they just have to up the game and be more forceful and more purposeful in terms of ensuring that you leverage on what you already have identified as a way or areas of improvement. And I think you can still do better. South Africa is still a better country on the continent, whether we like it or not.
But of course, we need that economic growth to speak to that.